What's going on, everyone? We're pretty excited to announce the launch of NA beers. Something people have been asking us for a while, and we've been trialing it kind of behind the scenes, and we finally feel like we're at the place to share what we've been working on. There's a few different ways to make NA beers. Historically and traditionally, it's all been done mechanically and through the use of equipment to basically strip out the alcohol that's already been made. This is like the O'Doul's method. So you would make a beer in the normal way, and then after it's done, you just remove the alcohol from it. The problem with this is that the beer, or that method, really damages the beer and it leaves it tasting bad, for lack of a better term. Well, I don't know if everybody's had O'Doul's. If you've had O'Doul's, you know what I'm talking about. It's not great. It still does taste like a beer, but you strip away the alcohol, but you strip away a lot of other stuff. Also, the equipment that does that process is really expensive and still is limited to big macro corps that can afford, essentially industrial factory macro equipment. Another method of making NA beer is to just simply combine a mixture of ingredients to simulate a beer experience. You actually see this a lot more in NA wines, where you have a mixture of herbs and flavors and a bunch of different stuff to try to simulate the beverage experience, obviously without the alcohol. The downside with this is you don't typically have fermentation happening. You're just simulating a fermentation or a fermented product, and it ends up falling flat. Not always. I've had some really great, specifically wines, done this way. Another method, and the one that we have been doing, is using a yeast that only does a small part of fermentation. So you still get fermentation characteristics, but it doesn't make enough alcohol to legally be called an alcoholic product or to get you drunk. This is kind of like kombucha, where kombucha is fermented and there is some levels of alcohol in kombucha, but it's not enough to be significant or to be of note. Kombucha doesn't taste like beer, though. You can't just put a SCOBY into beer and hope it'll make something that can simulate a beer drinking experience. It's just going to make kombucha something acidic and funky, and it's not beer. But that microbiological world is where all the NA beer advancement has come from. No longer do you need a really expensive machine to strip out alcohol. There's been a ton of research and advancement in yeasts that, brewer's yeast that you would use to make beer, but they have isolated certain strains that basically don't ferment much at all. And so they'll do just a tiny bit of fermentation to give off that fermentation characteristic, but it's not going to make enough alcohol to be significant. So how does this work? When a brewer's making beer, really they're making something called wort, which is just a sugary liquid, kind of like a sweet tea. You're pulling the sugars from grains like barley, and then the yeast will ferment those sugars to make beer, alcohol, a bunch of different stuff. That wort, that sweet tea, that sugary liquid is a whole mixture of a lot of different sugars, different types of sugars. And brewer's yeast will ferment most, if not all of them, to make something that's not that sweet and has a lot of alcohol in it, and that's beer. There are certain strains of yeast, though, that will ferment some types of sugars and not others. And this principle is basically what has driven the NA beer industry. In wort, in the stuff that's going to be fermented, you've got glucose, sucrose, maltose, maltotriose, and then the chains of sugars just get longer and longer. The NA beer yeast that's been bred and isolated to make NA beer, it only ferments glucose, so really simple sugars, and then it cannot ferment anything that's increasingly complex. And this is way oversimplified because there's a ton of other stuff we're doing to try to make the beer taste right. We acidify, we kind of tweak the starting gravity. We do a lot of like flavor adjusting stuff to make the beer good, or at least not terrible. But fundamentally, because of the advancement in these yeasts, we're able to have such a better starting point than in the past, where it was just have a machine that can strip out the alcohol, pay $1 million for that or whatever. I have no clue how much they cost. They're a lot. Or you just don't make NA beer. This is all kind of a work in progress, and we're going to continue to develop and dial in these NA beers and kind of see where they're landing. And having that yeast available that can only ferment glucose is huge for us. And that's kind of a new thing. It makes it super easy to make an NA beer because you can just buy that yeast. And so when we go to brew, so our first NA beer we're releasing is Hungry Ghost. It's a hazy IPA. That's one of our kind of core beers. We can just brew Hungry Ghost, ferment most of it with our normal house yeast, and then we can ferment another portion of it with that NA yeast and make an NA version of that beer. And that works for NA beer because in wort and the stuff that brewers brew, there's not that much glucose. The majority of the sugars are maltose. It's where you get malt from. That's the sugars that are being extracted from barley. And so the NA yeast can ferment the glucose, so you still have some fermentation happening, but kind of like kombucha, it doesn't do that much fermentation. And so the alcohol levels generally are kept below the 0.5% or whatever the legal limit is. People have asked me if I like the NA beer, and I think it's fine. I'm not a very good salesman on it. I'm not sober, so I drink beer and I like beer, and if I have regular Hungry Ghost next to NA Hungry Ghost, it's not the same. And I don't know if it ever will be the same. And so I'm not kidding myself about that. But there is something to be said about an NA product that puts you in the world of drinking, a hazy IPA. That's, it's not terrible, it's decent. And so you can kind of scratch that itch of having a beer if you're sober, and I think that's well worth the exploration. I will say that the people that we let try the trials we've done of these NA beers have really liked them, and I think that's awesome, and it's made us more confident to release them, to get to the point of releasing them. I think the main reason why people have liked ours is because it's fresh. So I can talk a lot about this, but there's been a proliferation of NA products, specifically NA beers, and because they're NA, they're not treated like an alcoholic product by the TTB or whatever. And so you can buy an NA beer just off most of these people's websites, and they can just ship it to your door because there's no alcohol, so there's no regulation. And what ends up happening is they're treated just like a Coke or something at that point. So if Costco or a big wholesaler buys a bunch of NA beer, they're just gonna treat it like I said, like a soft drink, and they'll store it in their warehouse, they'll store it warm, and they'll have it sit on the shelves for a while. And these products, they're not Coke, they're not built to stay on a shelf. It's not a mixture of just really specific chemicals that some analytical scientist put together. These are still beers with real ingredients, and they have a definite shelf life. They're not gonna mold or anything like that, but they go bad, just like a beer goes bad. And so when I've just had so many NA beers that are old and they taste gross, and a lot of times it's not because the beer, probably when you had it fresh at the place where it was made, it would be great, just like, you know, it would probably taste a lot like ours. But when they've been sitting warm in a warehouse for months and they're finally getting to your house and you're drinking it, that thing is, it's not good anymore. And I guess this is just a shameless plug of buying local, simply for the reasons that kind of the local movement started. It's like if you get something here, it is fresh, and we've been able to store it ourselves. We've been able to keep it cold, and we will not sell it if it gets bad or if it goes bad. We'll, you know, we're committed to serving the freshest product. For the time being, the NA beers we're making, you'll just be able to get them in the tap room and consumed on site. You'll notice if you order an NA Hungry Ghost, it's in a can. This is a whole thing about shelf stability of NA beers. They really have to be pasteurized to maintain shelf stability. You don't typically see them on draft for this reason. Draft systems don't have to be cleaned that often, simply because alcohol is it really just inhibits mold growth and bacterial growth. And so when you have something like an NA beer, it's full of the sugars that were unfermented. You know, the NA yeast can't ferment those sugars. They're still in there though. So you have a really sugary substance that mold will love to munch on, and you don't have alcohol in there to inhibit it. And so that's why you see most NA beers, if not all, are in cans, because you can pasteurize a can, and it's the same here. So it's only in cans, and we're not at the point yet of being comfortable to ship it out. Kind of goes back to, you know, as long as it's here, we can control the quality. Once it goes out of here, you know, we've got great partners, but there's only so much we can do to make sure it's, you know, it's kept cold and fresh and served fresh. So if you order one here, it will be fresh. It won't have alcohol, but it's going to be in a can. Hope you guys come out and try the NA Hungry Ghost. There's going to be more to come. We're going to do NA versions of a lot of our kind of core beers. Is the NA movement here to stay? Who knows? I think in a large part, yes. I think people generally are drinking less, and I think that's probably a good thing. Yeah, we're proud to have something if you're sober and like beer. Hopefully it scratches the itch for you. If it doesn't, we've got lots of other stuff. Coffee, kombucha, french fries, whatever. Thanks, guys.